you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
Today's guest is Liz Gatti. So Liz grew up on a Queensland property. So she started riding horses around the age of 8 or 9 and started off just helping her father and the other men on the property, just mustering sheep and cattle. Then later on in her early 20s, Liz had some lessons off Jack Makim and Ruth Emery, and it wasn't until she met her husband Chris that she commenced eventing, show jumping, and then later on specialised in dressage. I'm going to ask you very soon about that, Liz, about how you started eventing but wasn't until later that you specialised in dressage. In 1981, Liz went to the UK to commence training with the British Horse Society. She did her AI, and then when she returned, she started teaching full-time. Liz is now a qualified teacher, coach, educator, and spends her time training coaches and mature age riders. She's noticed that older riders have particular needs because of their changing physical abilities and mental, emotional needs, issues, and that's what she's going to talk about in the podcast. Now, Liz's favourite quote, she told me, is "look up." And do you have another favourite quote, Liz?
I do. I have "direction must be your primary focus when you're riding."
Okay, so just tell us, if we take the direction must be your primary focus, give us an example of when you needed to use that quote, someone that you were either teaching needed to use it or...
Definitely when I'm teaching, particularly coaching, people often, if they're riding around an arena and they're warming a horse up, they often don't really look where they're going. One of my riders who's been with me for many years has a tendency to go round in continual circles without really paying attention to where she's going, which is not, might be great for her to help her work out whether the horse is working well, but it's not really good for the horse. She really needs to focus on where she's going. Therefore, she is more likely to pick up where the issues with the horse are because of the feeling rather than the looking.
Yeah, I know what it's like, Liz. I was actually guilty of that this morning. I was going over some trot poles and I know I was looking down, so a little bit of self-coaching had to come in there. I had to tell myself to look up, look where I was going. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, just a little bit more about when you started riding. Do you remember when you first rode? You said around the age of 8 or 9. Just some early memory of your riding.
Actually, one of the very first memories I have of riding was I never had any formal coaching. When we were shearing the sheep in the shearing shed, the men would have the horses tied in the yards and they'd be inside working with the sheep. And the horses would be saddled. And I would pluck up the courage to go and just climb on a horse without it undoing it just while it was tied up. And that was my very first experience of climbing on a horse. It was quite an experience because they weren't ponies, they're actually full-size horses. And just sat there until I had plucked up enough courage to undo the reins and put them over the neck and then quietly walk around the yards until I was game enough to actually ride out. So it was very quietly and calmly poking around a sheep yards on a horse that was very quiet, luckily, but also... I knew nothing about it. It was totally a feeling thing. It was never a direction from anybody. I sort of learnt from there.
I'm just thinking too, because I do remember, being on a horse or being allowed to get on a horse and it was tied up. And it's something that I wouldn't do now is just to say, oh, sure, that horse is tied up. You can get on it. Yeah. But, we live and learn.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Okay. And now Jack Makim and Ruth Emery. Anything that you can say, yes, I learnt that, or this is where I started to do that when you were coaching or learning from them?
Jack was an ex-military man. He was quite an older man when I first had lessons with him, and he was very much involved in the Queensland Pony Club Association as high up in the levels of the PCAQ. And he had because he was military trained, he had very specific training methods that he used. But at the same time, they were also quite classical because of the way they train military personnel. And when I say military personnel, he actually had been, I think, I'm not sure he'd actually been artillery because we never had cavalry in Australia. They were only artillery officers, but they still rode. So he had a lot of training in that area. But he was very particular about position. He was all very particular about, again, where you were looking. Is also very particular about the contact you had with the horse's mouth. It was never allowed to be strong and it was always had to be correct. As you would say, yeah.
All right, now we'll move on just a little bit about your early eventing and show jumping days.
When I first met my husband, he was just dabbling with eventing. He had been riding quite a lot of his life, all sorts of things, but he was quite interested in show jumping and eventing. And when he became interested, he got me interested as well. So we used to go along to events together. We had sort of horses that were just normal, nothing particularly special.
Tell me about one of your earlier horses.
Well, actually, one of them was, I had a thoroughbred horse that I actually got off the track. In fact, a friend of mine raced him before I evented him. He was quite successful.
What was his name?
His name was Dual Success. So it was quite many years ago that we used to do a lot of the Pony Club one-day events because there wasn't a lot of official events at that stage. And I think we won our share of competitions over the years. And then my husband had a horse he bought in 1981 called Billy Jack, and he was a very successful horse. In fact, he was on the Queensland team and competed interstate on many occasions on the Queensland team, and he was quite successful with him in 3-day events as well as 2-day events and 1-day events. So, and I was more a groom and a helper and just a general, did everything for him, so he could focus on his riding and his competition. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, and then you went to the UK to get your first qualifications as a coach.
Yeah.
Certainly you've gone on and done a lot more since then, but this is when you first started teaching full-time. Can you remember a little bit about that?
I was interested in the coaching side of it, and there was nothing available, particularly in Queensland at that stage, and that was one of the reasons why I went to the United Kingdom, because the British Horse Society had very well recognised qualifications for coaches because they'd been doing it for many years. And I thought, well, that was a perfect opportunity for me to go over there and do the first level of it. And that was very, very good because I learned a lot. It was really, really, really beneficial for me. And when I came back to Australia after spending 4 or 5 months over there doing my full-time training, that my husband had bought a new horse and he was very, very interested in the eventing. So I really started helping him, but we also had a riding school on the Gold Coast at the time too, and we had quite a few people that were really interested in riding, and I really started teaching full-time there, teaching children and adults, particularly didn't necessarily have to be for competition, but certainly getting their basics right and doing a bit of everything, dressage, show jumping, a little bit of cross countries, and a lot of pony clubbers as well, so that they had the opportunity to get out there and really enjoy their riding, but doing it correctly.
All right, that's great, and we'll carry it full to now. You're spending a lot of time training coaches, and I particularly want to talk today about teaching mature-aged riders. We said about them having particular needs, so if you can just tell a little bit about that. Did you choose to teach mature-aged riders, or did it choose you?
I think to a certain extent it chose me, because a lot of the people riding, they don't always get the opportunity. These days there's a lot more young people ride. I think when I was first coaching, most people couldn't afford to buy a horse, or they didn't have the time until they were older. So I tended to teach more mature age riders. But I find now, probably because I'm in the mature age myself, I tend to gravitate towards those sort of people, because I find it very interesting to teach people who probably, a lot of them rode when they were younger but never did it formally. But now that they're older and they've got more time on their hands and maybe a bit more money to buy quality horses, they've decided to ride. And that's not always true. Some of them have continued to ride all that time. But I find it's a very interesting area, because as they age, there's issues that come in that affect how they ride. It also has an influence on what they do with their horses as well as how they ride them.
Okay, thanks, Liz. I'm going to ask you to talk about one particular or a couple of particular riders. You don't need to give us their names, but just give us a few examples of how they're different, and especially if you've taught them early and later.
One that I really want to talk about, I didn't teach her earlier. She's late 40s. She has a family. She has grown up girls, and she bought a really lovely big warm blood horse from Victoria, where she actually originally comes from. Now, this horse is an aged horse too, but because he is a warm blood, he has a very big movement, and he tends to be a little bit of a horse that has a tendency to come quite hollow. Now, people listening may not know what that means, but it means he lifts his head in the air and he drops his back away from underneath the rider's seat, and then his back feet come up behind him, so he doesn't really carry the rider very well. So this lady has a back issue. And as most women, as they get a little bit older, tend to sometimes put a bit extra weight on where they shouldn't. But she also has an issue which she's got quite a big busted woman, and you find a lot of women are like that, and it creates a lot of issues with their position on the horse and also how they ride. Now, she struggles a lot with maintaining her position and also making sure that the horse is able to carry her effectively. So she struggled a lot just riding him, particularly when she started to have to sit trot on him and try and ride him well forward into the contact with maintaining his back, keeping his back up so he could stay in the contact and really carry her. So she had a lot of problems just learning to ride the really big trot. And I find that happens a lot, particularly not just women but with men as well. Back issues come in. She also has issues with the shoulders because she has a job where she was using her arms a lot and her upper body, and it was creating a lot of problems with her shoulders. But you find that a lot of people have hip issues. They have knee issues as they get older from all sorts of different things. And that really affects the way they ride the horse, whether it's how they sit in the saddle, it's how they're able to maintain what I call a neutral body position, it's how they're able to carry the reins and ride the horse. To me, riding is about a really well-balanced position on the horse and being able to ride the horse from the seat into the contact. Therefore, if you're having a back issue, if you've got hip issues, it's really difficult to do that. And it even makes it more difficult if the horse you're riding has particularly big movement. So there's a lot of up and down that's happening as well as back sideways that riders have to cope with. When you're younger, you're fitter and you're more able to absorb that. As you get older, the core muscles aren't as good as they used to, particularly if women have had several children. It's an issue that they have to cope with as they get older. And also, even for men, a lot of men do a lot of physical work, therefore they end up with lower back issues, hip issues and knee issues because of the bending and lifting and that sort of thing. And there's also the loss of core strength can be a real problem.
Okay. So with these problems that the older riders do have, what should the older rider do? I mean, what different instructions are you giving the older rider to what you do, say, a younger or a more athletic rider? How do you make that different?
I'm probably more careful with how much I ask of them because I know that their physical capabilities are less as they get older.
Yep.
Therefore, we take a lot longer time to establish the ability to ride horses well, particularly with the seat. We also maybe slow the horse's paces down a little bit more until the rider is capable of riding them, and then we ask for the horse to move more with a bigger pace. Also, we do exercises on the ground, but we also try and make sure that they themselves get the help from outside the horse areas, like massage or something like that, where they might have a need to improve their physical capabilities. Also, with the problem of them not being able to ride as well as they could, some of them, because they've lost their flexibility, tend to lose their confidence a little bit about what they're doing. They're more concerned about if they come off, they're more concerned about if the horse plays up, where they're going to hurt themselves. That will happen if they've got families too, particularly women who've got children that they have to look after. They're much more inclined to be concerned if they do have an injury, if it's a major injury, who's going to look after the children. Is definitely a problem with more mature age, particularly if they've got families. Also, the loss of confidence can come from loss of flexibility on the horse if they don't bend as well or turn as well, or they don't have the coordination from the upper body to the lower body, or they don't have the coordination from hand to leg or things like that. That can be an issue too. Okay. And also, which is something I think about, but things like eyesight and hearing can be another issue too. Loss of hearing.
Right.
Eyesight may not be quite as good. Memory too, surprisingly enough, particularly if they're competing and they have to remember a dressage test. It can be a problem if they sort of suddenly have a mental blank or,
And do you find that there's a difference in fitness or...
Oh, most definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. I mean, it's more aware now that they need to be fit, but there's riding fit and there's physically fit. Like some people might walk, some people might jog, some might swim, some might do other sports, but riding requires a specific fitness. It's actually, you can only get riding fit by riding, and if they don't have a lot of time to ride, they don't necessarily, and they've only got one horse to ride, they don't necessarily become really truly riding fit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, while they're young and they've got several horses to ride, and some people ride anything up to 10 or 12 horses a day, of course they get very riding fit. But time is an issue for a lot of mature age people. They've got jobs, they've got families, they've got mortgages to pay, they've got bills to pay, they've got things to do.
Mm-hmm.
They've got children to run around after. They just don't have time.
Okay.
So, if they rode every day a week, they'd probably would be physically fit.
All right, and you've talked a little bit about loss of confidence as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you need to talk about there?
The confidence one is quite an issue because just coming back, for example, some women have ridden young when they were
Give
younger.
us an example.
Yeah, have ridden when they were younger, and they've had a family and they've been working, and so now they've got to the age where they think, oh, I've got a bit of time for myself. I'd like to ride again. So they'll get them to buy themselves a horse. Whether they get good advice or not from somebody is often an issue, because sometimes they buy a horse that they wanted when they were young, but now they're a lot older. It's not necessarily suitable for them as they get older. And the problem there is, as I said, is a horse with a big movement. If they're not as flexible as they were when they were young, a horse with a lot of exaggerated movement can be a big problem because they just can't sit on them. They just can't ride them well. They might be able to ride a trot on them, but even that can be an issue. But they've got to be able to ride the canter, and the trot can be a problem. The canter can be a problem too. But it's also the size of the horse too, I think. Everybody likes a lovely big horse, but then that can be a problem too because they've got to be able to get on and off.
Yep.
They've got and often a big horse has a big long stride.
Yep.
Yeah, it is a long way to fall, and if the horse happens to play up for any reason, and often if you're not confident, the horses pick up on that, and then they'll lose their confidence too because they need you to be the leader, not the follower. So they can start to shy at things, which creates problems. Horse jumps sideways and the rider's hanging off the side. They don't have the strength or the flexibility to get themselves back on, so they'll end up falling off and things like that. Or if they're jumping and the horse stops suddenly because they're not confident about jumping a fence and they're a bit cautious as they come out the fence, the horse stops and they're going to fly over the horse's head, and then they land on rails, and then they've got a sore back or they're bruised, or and they can't always get back on again when they need to, and it's a problem there too. So
I actually read the results of a survey a while ago, and sometimes riders didn't stop riding because they had a fall, but because they had a near fall. So just because someone doesn't necessarily have to fall off, they just have to nearly fall off and then think about it.
And that's a fear of fear itself.
Yes,
and that creates more problems, and it's harder to get through than actually when they come off and get back on again. Yeah, I think that's a big problem.
All right, now I want you to think about a time when you first started coaching older riders, more mature riders, when you didn't have the knowledge and the expertise that you have now, or you weren't quite as close. Some time when you as a coach, made an error in judgment, because at the moment you're coming along as a very experienced coach. But I want people to know that, it hasn't always been. There may be, sometimes you'll learn, and you don't want to learn by your mistakes and have the rider have a problem, but, when you just thought, wow, I wish I knew now what
what I know now. Definitely. I think I do. And every time I teach somebody, even if I've been teaching them regularly, I'm learning all the time, because you're observing the horse, you're observing the rider, you're looking at you're thinking of exercises you can use to help them. But probably quite a few years ago, there was probably mature age people that it's not so much perhaps that something I did wrong, it's just that I probably didn't give them enough information at the time because I didn't have that knowledge. So I could have helped them a lot more than I did at the time. They were probably quite happy with what I was telling them, but what I know now, I could have given them so much more help than I did, and they probably would have been a lot more successful. So it's one of those interesting areas. I don't stop learning. I still do lots of reading. I watch things. I still love to watch people ride, and I'm also a judge, so dressage judge. So I get to see quite a lot of riding. And my biggest issue, I think, particularly as a judge, is a lot of issues with the seat and the hand. The riders not having a good, well-balanced seat so that their hands are independent. I find that's an issue. And it's not necessarily an issue with older people. It can be an issue with younger ones as well. Yeah.
All right. So now I want you to tell me a specific time when a person or horse taught you to just change your ways or training methods or something. Think about a time where you used to train or ride or teach or do something a particular way, and then a person or a horse or someone has come along and you've thought, oh, I'm going to change my way, or, because people grow and evolve. It may be a book that you've read, it may anything.
Just in the last few years, I've come across quite an interesting French coach who has quite a different way of teaching horses. His name's Phillipe Karl, and he's actually has a very, very interesting concept about riding horses. He doesn't use the rein like the Germans or the old classical, if I call them classical type of trainers. He's actually from the French riding school, the Cadre Noir, and he was very high level there. He was actually the head rider there, and he's trained some really, really outstanding horses in his day. But he has it. Yeah, I really like his concept, and he teaches riders and horses all the way up to FEI level, and he has ridden at that level himself. But he has very, very interesting. And I after watching quite a few videos of him and his training, I've actually been to a workshop for one of the people he has trained here in Australia. I really like the concept that they have because it's very, very sympathetic to the horse. It's allowing the horse to find the contact rather than forcing it into a contact. It's about the rider riding the horse and really learning to feel what the horse is doing rather than pick up the reins and really drive them forward. I don't like that way of riding. And also, over the years, I had a very, very good German coach I rode with for many, many years, and I trained with for many years when I was really competing, and he had a huge influence on what I've done.
Who was the German coach?
That was Edgar Litchwark. I'm afraid Edgar and his wife both passed away now. They're no longer alive, but he was a very, very interesting man. He had amazing, amazing knowledge about riding and training horses, and I spent many, many hours sitting with him, watching him coach and discussing riding and coaching with him, and he's probably had more influence on my career than anybody else because of his knowledge. Amazing. Yep. He wasn't just a dressage person, he was a driving coach, he was also a show jumping and eventing coach. He had expertise in all levels, so it wasn't just that,
I think he was one of the youngest coaches ever to become qualified in Germany as that. Yep.
And his wife was very well qualified too. They both passed away now, which is a bit sad because it was a big loss when he passed away. There was many riders he taught were quite upset.
I have to say he was quite influential for me as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about thinking about the mature age riders. I want you to think about a time with a rider, your proudest moment where you've thought, wow, I'm really glad that I'm teaching this rider. I think I've really nailed it with a mature age rider. Yeah. Just tell me about something about that.
It's really lovely that you've asked about that because the woman I was talking about before who bought the aged warm blood horse that I do teach her quite regularly, when I first started teaching her, she'd been taught by another lower level coach. She lives in the country, so she's up quite a long way away from many coaches. She'd been taught by this person quite regularly for 2 years and never got off a 20-metre circle.
Okay.
Yeah, and when I started teaching her, we started doing all sorts of exercises. And now in the last 2 years, she's just competed, in fact, this weekend, just passed, for the second year in a row at Gladstone for their championships. Then she's been, the first year she was reserve preliminary champion. Last year she was champion, novice champion. This year she was champion elementary champion.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So
that's really good.
She was actually she's actually finally able to sit trot to him and really, and he's in his 20s, this horse. He's not a young horse, so he's amazing.
So mature-aged horses as well.
A mature-aged lady, and she's been really, really, really pleased. And it was lovely for her to be able to have the opportunity. That was the one thing she wanted to do, was to ride to elementary level. Because I think because he's not terribly sound, she's concerned now she may have to retire him. But she's got a daughter who loves to just poke around on him, so she'll be able to ride him. But that was one of my, I've had many others that have been quite successful too, but her particularly was one that I really liked. Yeah. Good.
Now, what does the future hold for you now, thinking about the riders that you've got?
I really love the coaching side of it and helping people, particularly, like I say, like the mature age riders. I still will continue my judging as long as I feel that I'm doing it well enough.
Yep.
I haven't ridden myself for a few years now, although I do still have horses, but it's more about helping other people with their riding and and also learning. I'm always learning. I'm always reading, and there's always new books on the market, and there's always new ideas, and there's often things you can watch and you can learn from.
Have you got a book then that you'd recommend to the listeners?
There is one. I think it's very good for at any level, and it's the book by Sally Swift, and it's called Centred Riding. And I think her understanding about riding, and she looks at it in a slightly different way, I think is a really, really, really good one for anybody to read and go from there, because she's very much into different learning styles, which
Yes.
is very important when you're teaching. And I think she's into visualizations and stuff like that, which I think is really important, because riding very much is a feeling sport. It's something that you need to ride to feel, and you learn from the feeling. You know, people can help you try and understand what you're doing when you feel something, but they can't help you with the feeling. You've got to learn that yourself, and that's one issue that I think you really need to learn yourself.
All right. Now, if you've got to give a message to mature age riders, just something before we finalise the podcast, so just a message, just if there's a mature age rider there that's listening to this, someone who's maybe not mature age yet, but plans to keep riding, what's a mature age, something, a tip or a lesson or something that you'd give to them?
Just keep riding and keep enjoying your riding is probably the most important thing, because I think it's really important that you still, because riding, even if you only ride one horse a couple of times a week, it still gives you a certain amount of fitness that you're probably not going to get if you're not doing anything. But horses are really, really, everybody gets into horses, they love it, and it's something that's in your blood, I think. But stay with it, and just learn to cope with it as you age, as your body changes, and try not to overface yourself by buying horses that you're just not able to ride. Be sensible about a horse you might be buying. And often it's not a good idea to buy a young horse unless you're really confident enough that you think you can run. Maybe a horse that's got a little bit more age on it, that's a little bit more set in its ways. Certainly we don't want unsound horses. That's obvious, you're not going to do that. But young horses can be an issue for older people because of the problems, the physical problems that it creates, and also the confidence. Confidence, I think, as you get older, really starts to be an issue. Not so much when you're young, but certainly as you get older. I think having the confidence to ride the horses and to ride well, and also being more aware of the shortcomings you might have physically, but also within your own ability. And I think as we get older, we sort of become more aware of what we're good at, what we're not good at. We sort of we're able to hopefully be honest with ourselves and say, okay, I know I can't do this, so I'm not going to attempt it. Or if I do attempt it, I know I'm not going to be as good as somebody else. So we've got to be aware that where our limitations are, but also enjoy what we do.
So probably be better than you were yesterday, not necessarily comparing yourself to your younger self.
Oh, definitely not. No, I think if we try to compare ourselves to the younger self, we won't be very happy. We won't enjoy our riding. But if we think, okay, I really love riding this horse because he makes me feel good. I really enjoy it. I love to get out and ride. We achieved a good walk transition today, or I did a lovely flying change or something. Be happy with that,
Okay.
Don't expect to suddenly be able to do sequence changes or camp pirouette.
All right. Now, just before we say goodbye, is there any way? You've done the final lesson. What about if they need to contact you to ask for more information? Do you have a detail, or they can contact you through the Horse Chats page?
I think through the Horse Chats page would be perfect, yes.
We'll do that, and we will have a Q&A, so we might ask you back for a Q&A about older riders, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to do that.
Wonderful. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Glenys.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.